Welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. This is the format called Freedom Under Fire, the top 3 headlines you need to know about. Each Freedom Under Fire segment does 3 things. Number 1, it keeps you on top of the most important issues affecting your freedoms. Number 2, it lets you know why it matters. And number 3, it tells you what you can do about it. So let's go. Here are the top 3 headlines for the week of April 10th, 2023. Headline number 1, Army Sergeant convicted of murder says he shot in self-defense after man aimed AK-47 at him during BLM riot. So what's going on? A Texas jury found Daniel Perry guilty of murder Friday in the 2020 death of Garrett Foster. The event occurred in Austin in 2020 at the height of the at times violent Black Lives Matter protests and the riots of 2020. Perry was driving an Uber in downtown Austin when he came upon a non-permitted group of BLM protesters illegally clogging the intersection. After making a turn, the protesters followed his car. They surrounded it, they pounded on it, they threw rocks at it. According to Perry's account, a masked Foster approached his car and pointed an AK-47 at him. Some witnesses deny that Foster raised his rifle. Perry reportedly fired 5 times at Foster, fatally wounding him. Perry was a concealed carry permit holder who was an active duty soldier stationed at Fort Hood at the time. And though armed, Foster did not fire a shot. Another protester in the crowd shot at Perry's car 3 times, hitting no one. Right after that, Perry called 911 and turned himself into police only seconds later, saying that he'd shot Foster in self-defense. Well, a year later, a grand jury indicted Perry for murder and 2 other charges. The lead detective in the case at the time ruled Perry's actions were justifiable homicide. And that same detective accused district attorney of illegal actions, including witness tampering and withholding evidence from a grand jury. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has requested that the Board of Pardons and Paroles determine if Perry should be granted a pardon. What a mess. So why does this matter? Well, as a disclaimer, I obviously am not in a position to judge this ruling. However, this matters for many reasons. And if you believe in the Second Amendment and protecting yourself, protecting your family, protecting your property, well, there's a lot to learn here. It matters because there's an open and growing hostility in legislation and the courts as it relates to gun control. This incident happened in Austin, Texas, and everybody always assumes that Texas is a pro-gun Second Amendment state, but that simply is not the case. It depends on where you live, of course. Austin, Texas is increasingly dominated by Marxist, defund the police rhetoric and policies, and there has been a targeted push to put George Soros-funded attorney generals in place who actively undermine the Constitution. By the way, this is happening all around the country. You may be living in an area like this, where it may be very difficult to get a favorable verdict in the event that you're involved in a conflict with a firearm. It also matters because we all remember the BLM and Antifa riots of 2020 that the media said were, quote, mostly peaceful, end quote, even though we could see with our own eyes. The violence, the looting, the rioting, it was completely out of control, with thousands of police officers injured, at least 15 people dead, and upwards of $2 billion in damage. Well, we can all put ourselves in those situations, can't we? This matters because if you have firearms to protect yourself or your family or your property or business, or if you also have a concealed carry permit, you have a serious duty and obligation to handle those firearms as safely as possible to avoid potential legal problems. Well, what can you do about this? What does it matter, and what can you do? Well, first, know your state and local gun laws and follow them very carefully. Number 2, join an organization like the USCCA, the U.S. Concealed Carry Association, which includes training, videos, and information that helps you become mentally, physically, and legally prepared, including self-defense liability insurance. And number 3, anticipate and avoid as many dangerous circumstances or situations as possible. As crime and chaos escalates and cities experiment with defunding the police nonsense, it's more important now than maybe ever before to exercise your 2A rights and be properly trained to protect yourselves. That's headline number 1. Headline number 2, a new Supreme Court case could turn every workplace into a religious battleground. Well, what's happening? Well, a postal worker in Pennsylvania was denied Sabbath accommodation. All Americans should have the freedom to work without being forced to choose between their faith and their job. But that's the choice that Gerald Groff's employer forced him to make. Groff, a United States Postal Service worker, firmly believes that he must observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. When the post office began delivering Amazon packages on Sundays, Groff's supervisor granted him an accommodation to observe his Sunday Sabbath. But a few years later, the post office withdrew that accommodation and scheduled him on Sundays. During that time, Groff was also subjected to harsh and unfair treatment. He was mocked by his supervisor and docked pay without justification. After 2 years of progressive discipline, hostility from supervisors, and not knowing if any day was the day he would be terminated, Groff resigned in 2019. Well, in 2023, the United States Supreme Court accepted the case and will determine if the law requires employers to grant meaningful religious accommodations to people of faith. Well, why does this matter? Why does this matter to us? First, it matters because it can be argued that there's an increasing hostility towards people of faith, where the courts are unfortunately becoming the only path to protecting individual rights and religious freedoms. Thankfully, the Supreme Court has of late been pretty consistently ruling in favor of protecting religious liberty, free speech, and other constitutionally protected rights, such as the right to life. Recent cases, such as Coach Kennedy praying at the 50-yard line after a high school football game, have found that you do not have to suspend or deny your private faith when you step into public spaces. And that's really good news. But this case also matters because it's likely that if you live out your faith and beliefs in a courageous way, it is more likely that you will face backlash, persecution, and potentially legal opposition for doing so. A very recent and highly contentious example of this was when people in all kinds of professions sought religious exemptions to avoid vaccine mandates as a condition of employment. Literally tens of thousands of people were denied those exemptions and lost their jobs. Police, nurses, first responders, military personnel, teachers, you name it. They all took a stand and they all lost their jobs. So what can you do about it? Well, number one, the reminder here is to live out your faith and beliefs with courage. If we don't, our religious liberties will be a thing of the past. Number two, be willing to pay the price of standing with Christ and doing the right thing. If we remain silent, those who come after us will not have the freedoms that we do. And number three, if you have experienced religious discrimination in the workplace or at school or any other environment, contact our friends at First Liberty Institute or Alliance Defending Freedom, and we'll get you the help that you need. That's headline number 2. Well, headline number 3 is this. The FBI is caught putting undercover agents in churches to spy on Christians. What in the world is going on? Well, Catholic Americans are being targeted for investigation by the FBI as people at risk of being or becoming violent extremists because of, quote, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, and white supremacist ideology, all of which, of course, is nonsense. But the FBI used an undercover employee to inform its leaked analysis on domestic extremism among Catholic Americans. House Judiciary Committee Republican Ohio Representative Jim Jordan revealed in a letter to the FBI Director Christopher Wray. The investigation was initiated after the leak of the January 23rd FBI Richmond Field Office memo suggesting that Roman Catholic groups who preferred the Latin Mass are at greater risk of being radicalized. The FBI's plan for Richmond, Virginia parishes involved contacting mainline Catholic parishes and the local leadership. The FBI also planned to develop new sources with placement and access to report on suspicious activity within the church. We know from whistleblowers that the FBI distributed this document to field offices across the country. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that the FBI is infiltrating the Catholic Church? Well, number one, the FBI is being weaponized by the DOJ against law-abiding citizens based upon their religion. In this case, the Catholics, based upon their biblical beliefs around life, gender, and immigration. This is another clear case of targeted religious persecution. And at the same time, the DOJ has done virtually nothing to investigate the over 67 cases of vandalism, threats, and destruction of property at Catholic churches and pro-life pregnancy resource centers since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This administration is extremely hostile to people of traditional Christian faith, and we need to see it now for what it is. Well, what can you do about it? Well, if you attend a Catholic church, make sure that your priests and leadership are aware of what's going on and verify that they are not involved in any way. Number two, make sure that they make the congregants aware of the FBI's intent to infiltrate the church so that they also can be prepared. And number three, vote for people who have demonstrated a strong personal practice of faith and a strong defense of religious liberties. We have to remove people from leadership who weaponize the government against people of faith. That simply is un-American and immoral. That's headline number three. Well, freedom is under fire every day, and now is the time to stand up and protect our liberties wherever they're under attack. I'm Jimmy Page, and this is the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast.